The courtroom was a mix of tense silence and nervous energy as Tanya Williams, dressed in a simple blazer and slacks, stepped forward. She had been here before, many times, though never quite like this. The stakes had never felt higher. As she approached the bench, the weight of her purpose seemed to press down on her shoulders. Today, it wasn't just about a case. It was about showing up, standing firm, and refusing to back down, even when the odds felt stacked against her. Judge Gregory Wright, a man in his mid-50s with a sharp suit and a no-nonsense attitude, peered down at her over his glasses. His reputation for fairness was well known in the community, but so was his firm belief that the law should be upheld at all costs. Tanya had known that coming into this courtroom, but something about his calm demeanor made her wonder if he fully understood the world she was trying to change. "Ms. Williams," Judge Wright's voice broke through the air, steady and authoritative. "You've been charged with violating local ordinances by participating in a protest without the proper permits. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Tanya paused, meeting his gaze. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the old courthouse air conditioning. She could feel the eyes of the spectators on her, many of them there to support her cause. She knew that they were hoping she'd stand her ground, hoping she'd speak out against the system that, to many, felt rigged from the start. But she didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Instead, she chose her words carefully. "Your Honor," she began, her tone calm but unwavering, "I am here today because of a cause that's much bigger than any law or ordinance. The people who were with me at that protest were simply standing for what is right. Sometimes, standing up for justice means stepping outside the boundaries of tradition." Judge Wright listened carefully, his lips pressed into a thin line. He'd heard many arguments in his career, some impassioned, some defensive, but there was something different about this woman. Her words weren't just about a protest. They were about something that tugged at the very fabric of the justice system. He shuffled through his papers, pulling out the details of her case. "I understand your perspective, Ms. Williams," he said after a pause, his tone measured. "But I must also consider the law as it stands. This was an unlawful assembly, and I'm afraid the fine stands." Tanya didn't flinch. She had prepared herself for this moment. She wasn't here to change his mind, at least not today. She was here to make sure that even in a small-town courtroom, her message resonated. The gavel struck, and the fine was imposed. The room remained silent as Tanya nodded respectfully and walked back to her seat. As she did, she caught the eyes of several onlookers, some disappointed, others inspired by her calm composure. The judge may have seen a simple violation of the law, but Tanya knew this was just the beginning. Her work was far from over, and it would take more than a fine to stop her. Little did Judge Wright know, the woman he had just fined was quietly reshaping global conversations on justice, and his decision today would soon become part of a story much bigger than he'd ever expected. As Tanya walked out of the courthouse, she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came after a public stand. It was nothing new for her. Facing resistance was part of the journey, and she had long since accepted that change never came without friction. The fine, a temporary setback, nothing more. She had faced worse in her years of activism, but today was different. Today, she knew that the seed of something much larger had been planted, even if only a few people recognized it just yet. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of supporters gathered, waiting to offer words of encouragement. Many of them had traveled hours to join her protest, and their faces were filled with pride, not disappointment. The system may have taken a small victory today, but Tanya's resolve only seemed to strengthen in the face of it. She waved to the crowd, giving them a brief, reassuring smile, before heading to her car, where she allowed herself a few moments of silence. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Great work today, Tanya. We're proud of you." A message from her longtime friend and fellow activist, Sarah Reed. Tanya replied quickly, "Thanks, Sarah. It's just the beginning." And it was. Tanya had been involved in grassroots movements for years, her voice rising above the noise of local protests to resonate in boardrooms, at international conferences, and across global networks. While most people saw her as a figure leading local protests, they didn't realize the full extent of her influence. Tanya had quietly, but decisively, built relationships with some of the world's most powerful organizations and individuals. Behind the scenes, Tanya was an integral part of initiatives that pushed for concrete change in policies that affected marginalized communities around the world. She was a key player in the Global Equality Network, an international coalition working to implement and monitor progressive equality policies in countries with some of the worst records for social justice. She had spoken with UN leaders, advised heads of state, and worked on drafting proposals that could reshape entire nations. Her work had sparked national dialogues in countries across Europe, Africa, and Latin America about how the law could better reflect the principles of fairness and inclusion. Her recent campaign on reforming racial equality laws had gained traction in a number of major cities, with several local governments adopting her proposed frameworks for legislative change. Tanya wasn't just organizing protests anymore. She was orchestrating real, lasting reforms that could echo for generations. Yet, despite her global impact, Tanya's name rarely made the front page of newspapers. Her true work was often behind closed doors, in the quieter meetings where policies were shaped, analyzed, and put into action. It wasn't about the limelight for her. It was about the change she could bring into the world. And today, her message had reached a new audience. Judge Gregory Wright. He had seen only one part of her journey. But soon, he would understand that what had happened in his courtroom was a small chapter in a much larger story, a story that was already beginning to change the world. Judge Gregory Wright couldn't shake the image of Tanya Williams from his mind. It wasn't just her calm, unwavering presence in the courtroom that lingered. It was the conviction in her words. For the first time in his career, he found himself questioning the very foundations of his role as a judge. Was he just upholding the law? Or was he contributing to a system that needed to change? He had made a judgment based on the law as it stood, but Tanya's argument wasn't just about legality. It was about morality, about fairness in its most fundamental form. In the days that followed, the case sat on his mind. The small-town courthouse was a far cry from the world-changing conversations Tanya had alluded to, but Judge Wright's curiosity grew. Who was this woman who had walked into his courtroom with the quiet confidence of someone who had already seen so much more than a small-town judge could ever know? What was she really about? He did what he rarely did. He began to dig deeper. A few quick online searches turned up articles about Tanya that made him pause. She wasn't just another protester. She was a key figure in global equality initiatives. He found her name attached to international coalitions, speaking engagements at global summits, and advisory roles with influential organizations like the United Nations. Tanya had become a trusted voice, working with governments to tackle issues of racial equality, social justice, and human rights. The more he read, the more amazed he became. Her influence wasn't confined to local activism. Tanya had been behind policy changes in several countries, especially in the areas of racial justice and reforming law enforcement practices. Her work had led to reforms in countries where systemic inequality ran deep, from Europe to Africa, where governments had acknowledged and worked to rectify their flawed justice systems, often guided by Tanya's counsel. Judge Wright felt an unsettling sense of realization. His decision to fine her had been based on the narrow view of a local issue, yet here was a woman who was shaping global policy. He felt a sense of awe mixed with guilt. How had he, a man who prided himself on fairness, been so quick to dismiss her message? Was he simply upholding a tradition of justice, or was he part of a system that ignored the very issues Tanya was fighting against? Determined to understand more, Judge Wright continued to read about Tanya's initiatives. One article in particular struck him, an interview where she spoke about how legal systems, including his own, needed to evolve. She talked about how true justice meant understanding the nuances of the law and its impact on real lives, and how important it was for leaders in all sectors to listen to those who had experienced inequality firsthand. As he read, He began to feel a growing sense of responsibility. The more he learned, the more he realized that his interaction with Tanya wasn't just another case. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance to re-examine everything he thought he knew about justice. What if the law itself was part of the problem? What if Tanya was not only right, but also someone who could lead the way to a better, more equitable system? The questions haunted him as he closed his laptop late that night. He knew he couldn't stay idle for long. Something had to change, not just in the world, but in his own understanding of his role as a judge. And for the first time in a long while, Judge Wright felt that perhaps he wasn't the one with all the answers. Maybe, just maybe, Tanya Williams had them. Weeks passed, and Judge Gregory Wright found himself unable to let go of his growing fascination with Tanya Williams. He couldn't stop thinking about her calm demeanor in the courtroom, her powerful words, and the ripple effect her work seemed to have around the globe. It wasn't just that she was an activist. She was a leader, someone whose influence stretched far beyond what he could ever have imagined. He felt both awe and guilt as he realized the enormity of her impact. Then, as if the universe had conspired to answer his unspoken questions, an invitation appeared on his desk. A high-profile conference on global equality was coming up in Washington, D.C. The flyer featured Tanya Williams as one of the keynote speakers. It was the perfect opportunity for him to see her work in action, to understand her vision firsthand. For the first time, Judge Wright considered stepping outside his usual boundaries, away from his courtroom and into a space where discussions about justice, fairness, and reform were happening at the highest levels. He decided to attend. The day of the conference arrived, and the auditorium was filled with prominent activists, policymakers, academics, and human rights leaders. Judge Wright, wearing his usual black suit but feeling slightly out of place, scanned the room. He was one of the few legal professionals in the audience, and as the opening speeches began, he noticed how little he knew about the discussions taking place around him. He had spent so many years enforcing the law that he had never stopped to truly examine its flaws. Until now. When Tanya Williams finally took the stage, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The audience quieted, and even the most experienced activists leaned forward in their seats. Tanya stood tall, her presence commanding yet approachable. She spoke not just about the problems facing marginalized communities, but about solutions, about actionable steps that governments and institutions could take to break the cycle of inequality. Her words were not abstract or theoretical. They were grounded in lived experience, backed by the policies she had helped implement around the world. Judge Wright listened intently, mesmerized. Tanya spoke about the need for judges and legal professionals to actively engage in reform, to question the systems they served, and to acknowledge how often the law failed those it was supposed to protect. Her message was clear. It was time for a new kind of justice, one that included voices from all walks of life. Justice isn't just about applying the law, Tanya said, her voice unwavering. It's about seeing the human beings behind the cases, understanding their lives, and creating a system that serves all people fairly. This isn't just a fight for today. It's a fight for tomorrow. And it begins with us. Judge Wright felt a wave of emotion wash over him. For the first time in years, he realized how much he had taken his position for granted. He had always believed that by following the law, he was doing what was right. But Tanya had just shown him that justice was about more than laws. It was about humanity, empathy, and ensuring that the law worked for everyone, not just those who fit within its established boundaries. As the speech ended, the applause was deafening. Tanya stepped down from the podium, and Judge Wright found himself clapping along with the rest of the crowd, though his mind was miles away. He had come to hear her speak, but what he really gained was a new understanding, a new perspective that would change the way he viewed his work forever. After the conference, Judge Gregory Wright couldn't escape the feeling that his world had shifted. The once clear lines he had drawn between his duties as a judge and the broader issues of justice had suddenly blurred. The questions Tanya Williams had raised echoed in his mind. What does true justice look like? How do we reconcile the law with real lives? Back in his office, he found himself staring at his desk for hours, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. His case against Tanya, which had once seemed like a routine legal matter, now felt like a stark reminder of his narrow approach to justice. He had dismissed her with a fine, yet she was leading the charge to create a more equitable world, a world where judges like him needed to be more than just enforcers of law. They needed to be advocates for fairness, aware of the systems they were upholding and the lives they were affecting. He couldn't stop thinking about her speech, how she had painted a picture of a future where the law worked not just for the privileged few, but for everyone, especially the marginalized and oppressed. The clarity of her vision haunted him. What had seemed like an act of rebellion in his courtroom now seemed like a call to action. Tanya wasn't just breaking the rules. She was challenging the very idea of what it meant to be just in a world where so many were overlooked. For days, Judge Wright wrestled with his conscience. He reflected on his career, his decisions, and the assumptions he had always carried about the law. The more he thought about Tanya's words, the more he realized that the law could be used as a tool for justice, but only if those in power were willing to make the tough calls, to confront their biases, and to be open to change. In the solitude of his office, he began reading more of Tanya's work. He found herself quoted in articles, giving interviews about her work in the Global Equality Network, and advocating for systemic reforms that would fundamentally shift how justice was administered. The more he learned, the more he saw how limited his own understanding had been. She wasn't just another activist. She was a visionary, someone whose ideas could reshape not only national policies, but global attitudes toward fairness and equality. One night, as he pored over a particularly moving article in which Tanya discussed her vision for judicial reform, something clicked. He realized that her advocacy for a more inclusive, empathetic approach to justice wasn't just theoretical, it was practical, and it was urgently needed. It was in that moment of realization that Judge Wright made a decision. He had to act. He couldn't just be a bystander any longer. The way he had approached Tanya's case, the fine he had imposed, had been a symptom of a much larger problem. One he now recognized he was complicit in. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "I need to meet with Tanya Williams," he said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. He didn't know what the meeting would lead to, but he knew it was time to start a conversation that could change everything, not just for him, but for the system he had once thought he fully understood. Tanya Williams had seen her fair share of formal meetings, conferences, and interviews, but when she received an unexpected request for a meeting with Judge Gregory Wright, she felt a mix of curiosity and caution. She had assumed that her encounter with the judge in the courtroom would be a one-off experience, a minor chapter in a much larger journey. But something in his tone when he reached out to her intrigued her. There was a sincerity there, a desire to understand, to learn. It was a rare quality in someone who had, just weeks earlier, imposed a fine on her for standing up for what she believed was right. The meeting was set for a quiet cafe in the heart of the city. Tanya arrived first, taking the seat by the window, her eyes scanning the street as she waited. Judge Wright arrived a few minutes later, dressed casually, a sharp contrast to the formality of the courtroom. As he approached, Tanya stood and extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Judge Wright said, his voice tentative. He seemed out of his element, and Tanya could see that the walls he had built over years of legal practice were now beginning to crumble, piece by piece. "Of course," Tanya replied, her voice warm but measured. "I'm always open to conversation, especially when it comes to understanding how we can make systems better." They sat down, and for a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was charged with unspoken questions, unacknowledged tension. Tanya took a deep breath and decided to break the silence. "You said you wanted to meet," she began. "I'm guessing it's about something beyond the fine you imposed on me." Judge Wright's eyes flickered with a mix of regret and earnestness. He cleared his throat before responding. "I've been thinking a lot about that day in your courtroom, about how I reacted, and about what you said. I realize now that I only saw a small part of the story. You weren't just challenging a local law. You were challenging an entire system. A system I've spent my whole life serving. Tanya's expression softened. You were doing your job, Judge Wright. But that job, like any other, needs to evolve. It's not about following laws blindly. It's about questioning them when they fail to serve people equitably. The conversation began to flow more easily after that, as they spoke openly about the frustrations of the legal system, the way laws had been designed to protect the status quo, and how it was often up to people like Tanya to push for change. She spoke of the global networks she had helped build, the work she had done with international leaders, and the reforms she had advocated for that were beginning to make an impact. But it wasn't just the policies that mattered to her. It was the people whose lives were shaped by them. The people who had been left behind by a system that didn't always see them. Judge Wright listened, rapt, as Tanya shared stories of families torn apart by injustice, communities stifled by outdated laws, and governments too slow to act. He began to see her not just as an activist, but as a force for real, transformative change, a woman whose vision for a better world was grounded in both empathy and action. "This is why I reached out to you," Judge Wright said, his voice more assured now. "I spent too long in my own bubble, doing what I thought was just. But I see now that real justice isn't about applying the law without questioning it. It's about understanding the human element, the impact these laws have on people's lives." Tanya nodded, a hint of satisfaction in her smile. "Exactly. It's a shift in perspective. The law needs to evolve, just like society does." As they continued to talk, a sense of mutual respect grew between them. Judge Wright no longer saw Tanya as a defiant figure. He saw her as someone whose work had the potential to reshape the very systems he had once believed in. He wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but one thing was certain: his understanding of justice would never be the same, and for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the possibility of real change. A few weeks after their meeting, Judge Gregory Wright found himself sitting at his desk, staring at the blank screen of his computer. The weight of what he had learned, of what Tanya Williams had opened his eyes to, sat heavily on his conscience. He had always thought of himself as someone who upheld the law with integrity, who believed in justice as a principle that transcended personal opinions. But now, after hearing Tanya's insights and reflecting on the way his own decisions had played out in real lives, he knew he had to do more. Tanya had been right. Justice wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the human stories behind it. It was about questioning the systems that were meant to protect, yet so often failed the very people they were supposed to serve. Judge Wright couldn't ignore this any longer. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He had to speak up. With his fingers hovering over the keyboard, he began to type. His words started slow, tentative, as he tried to find the right way to express what he was feeling. He needed to acknowledge his mistake, but more than that, he needed to set a precedent, one that showed other legal professionals that it was okay to reassess their approach to justice, to listen, and to learn from those who were fighting for a more inclusive world. After several drafts, he finally settled on an op-ed for the local newspaper, one he knew would spark conversation. It wasn't just about him admitting to a personal error. It was about shifting the narrative. He didn't just want to apologize for finding Tanya Williams. He wanted to encourage other judges, lawyers, and legal professionals to reflect on the broader implications of their decisions. The headline read, "Re-examining Justice, a judge's reflection on what it means to serve all people." In the article, Judge Wright wrote about his experience with Tanya and how her advocacy for global equality had changed his understanding of the law. He reflected on how his previous actions, while technically correct, had overlooked the broader mission of justice. He spoke about the importance of creating a legal system that not only punished violations, but also actively worked to correct systemic inequalities. "I am not proud of how I handled Ms. Williams's case," he wrote, "but I am proud to say that her words, her passion, and her commitment to fairness have opened my eyes to the work that still needs to be done. We, as legal professionals, have a responsibility to be more than enforcers of the law. We must become advocates for justice, reformers who listen, learn, and evolve alongside the society we serve. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The local paper's editorial team received letters of support from across the country, from legal professionals to everyday citizens who had been moved by Judge Wright's public admission. Many expressed gratitude for his vulnerability and willingness to challenge his own beliefs. Some praised him for leading the way in demonstrating that justice required more than rigid adherence to outdated norms. It required growth and empathy. But it wasn't just about the public recognition. What truly mattered was the ripple effect Judge Wright's article had within the legal community. Colleagues began reaching out, asking for conversations, for guidance on how they, too, could start reevaluating the systems they were upholding. Lawyers, judges, and lawmakers in different parts of the country acknowledged that this was a pivotal moment for the justice system. The first step toward reform had been taken, not through policy change, but through a shift in mindset. And in a small but significant way, Judge Wright knew that he had begun to make a difference, not just in his own courtroom, but in the world at large. It was only the beginning, but it was a step toward the kind of justice Tanya Williams had been advocating for all along. Months passed since Judge Gregory Wright's public acknowledgement, but the impact of his op-ed continued to reverberate. The legal community was abuzz with discussions about the evolution of justice, about the need for a more inclusive, empathetic approach to law enforcement. Judge Wright's reflections had sparked a broader conversation that rippled across courthouses, law schools, and even legislative chambers. The idea that justice wasn't just about following the letter of the law, but understanding the deeper implications of the law on real lives, began to take root. As for Tanya Williams, her work continued, but now there was something new in the air, a recognition that her message was reaching unexpected places. Her influence had always been global, but Judge Wright's public admission had elevated her cause to an entirely new level. It wasn't just about reforming policies anymore. It was about changing the way legal professionals approached their work, reshaping the entire mindset of justice. In a few months, Tanya found herself speaking at a major legal symposium where Judge Wright was one of the invited guests. The room was filled with lawyers, judges, and policymakers from all over the world. Tanya took the stage first, as planned, and delivered one of her most passionate speeches yet. "The legal system is powerful," she said, her voice steady but full of conviction. "But its true power comes from its ability to adapt. It must evolve to meet the needs of the people it serves, not the other way around. Every law, every verdict, every ruling should be viewed through the lens of human dignity." The audience sat in rapt attention as she spoke, and when she finished, the applause was thunderous. But it wasn't just her words that resonated. It was the realization that change was not only possible, but already underway. After her speech, Tanya took a seat at the panel, where Judge Wright was also present. As he spoke about his own journey of self-reflection, of how he had come to understand the need for reform, there was a shift in the room. His voice, once so certain and firm, now carried with it a humility that was rare for someone in his position. He wasn't just talking about justice. He was talking about the future of law itself. "The law is meant to serve all people," Judge Wright said, "but it can only do that if we, the ones who enforce it, are willing to question our own biases, our own assumptions. The system can't change until we, as individuals, are willing to change." It was a powerful moment, one that left an indelible mark on everyone in the room. There, in front of some of the most influential figures in the legal field, a judge who had once been an activist was now advocating for the kind of systemic reform she had been pushing for all along. And alongside him was Tanya, not just as an activist, but as a catalyst for change, a reminder that true justice requires not just action, but a willingness to listen, learn, and grow. In the weeks that followed, Tanya and Judge Wright continued to collaborate, advising governments on justice reform, speaking together at various events, and pushing for the implementation of policies that prioritized fairness and inclusivity. Their partnership, unexpected as it was, became a symbol of how change could be achieved when people from different walks of life came together to challenge the status quo. Together, they had begun to reshape the way the world viewed justice, and they were only getting started. What had started as a courtroom encounter had grown into a global movement, one that would leave a lasting legacy for generations to come.